Welcome to session 9 of our class on Biblical Worldview 1. We're in chapter 3, and after the introduction to the chapter, they speak of the authors speak of the tight connection with Genesis. And the fact is that if you go to the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus 1, then you will see that the account simply ties into the two books tie into each other very well. If you go up to Genesis chapter 50, as soon as my computer gets to working here, let's just start with verse 22 of chapter 50. Now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons. Also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household. So you can see how the end of chapter 50 goes right into the beginning of Exodus chapter 1. It connects very well. That is one way of showing the connection. And then the way that they bring out the connection is that the narrative of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph is tightly connected again to Exodus. Okay. And they say, remember, in Genesis 35:10, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. At the end of Genesis, his descendants are living in Egypt, where Joseph had risen to power and had helped to save Egypt from a terrible famine. And Exodus 1:1 opens this new episode by connecting back to this family and letting us know that the great narrative is unfolding around this particular family. The book of Genesis mentioned the sons of Israel 12 times. In Exodus, however, this term is used 125 times. And this term, sons of Israel, will be used to define the new nation that emerges in Exodus. In fact, many English Bibles translate the expression sons of Israel simply as Israelites. Now, as I said in the last session, this term sons of Israel is very specific to the people that have descended from the physical descendants of Jacob or Israel, okay, and his 12 sons. And that name or that designation is not used in the New Testament to speak of Christians, but what is used is sons of Abraham or children of Abraham. again, skipping over the Mosaic covenant, bringing the Abrahamic covenant into the New Testament to be the covenant that continues into the New Testament, but connected very well or very clearly with the Abrahamic covenant. And again, only parts of that are still to be fulfilled and are being fulfilled. As they point out again, we remember that the covenant that God made with Abraham in Genesis, in chapters 12, 15, and 17, drives the narrative of Exodus. The critical components of the covenant, land, fulfilled at the end of Joshua, numerous descendants, which would include not only the physical descendants, but the spiritual descendants of Abraham, those who are children of Abraham by faith under the new covenant. A great nation, again, it was fulfilled in Israel. And then blessings, which again were fulfilled to a great extent in the life of Israel in general, Abraham and his direct descendants specifically, okay? That is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and so forth. But God's promise to bless Israel if they will obey him, that's made very clear in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Now, the next part of chapter 3 that is talked about is the major characters. The slideshow in the first, let me go back to the slideshow for a moment. Slideshow in slide number 2 talks about the tight connection with Exodus or with Genesis. But slide number 2 is where we get into the major characters and the discussion of that. The major characters, as is pointed out in the book and in the slideshow, are God, Moses, and Pharaoh. God, or Moses, is God's representative or ambassador to Pharaoh. He also establishes Moses as the leader of the Israelites. But God also himself shows up frequently and plays a major role in this part of the narrative. The book of Exodus as a whole gives us a tremendous insight into the character of God. Now, there are actually 2 different pharaohs, as is pointed out here in the book, in the narrative of Exodus. And that is in chapters 1 and 2, there is the Pharaoh that knew Joseph, and the Pharaoh that Joseph was second in command to. But there was another one that rose up, as chapter 3 and verse 1 says, that did not know Joseph. But both rulers are simply called Pharaoh. And we are not told which Pharaoh this is, okay, as is stated in slide number 4. Pharaoh is unnamed and is the archetype, that is to say, the beginning of a type of person in the scriptures concerning all things that are opposed to God. That is, from the very beginning, Pharaoh resists God, okay? And they point out that the lack of naming Pharaoh, or at least the particular Pharaohs involved, because, there were many pharaohs, that had different names, There was Pharaoh Ramses. Uh, then there was a female Pharaoh for a while. Her name was Hatshepsut. So, just like the different Herods in the New Testament, there's Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, and so forth. So this is Pharaoh is a throne name, so to speak, and it actually means in I believe it's in Hebrew, but it may be in Egyptian. It's been a while since I looked at it, but it simply means big house. The word Pharaoh means big house, so it's the guy who lives in the big house. But as far as identifying the actual pharaohs, the scriptures don't do that. And in fact, they point out that the Bible is not shy about giving us the names, of foreign kings and pharaohs. In fact, this is the norm. So therefore, not naming the pharaoh in Exodus, or the two pharaohs, might be significant. And he says scholars are still arguing over who was the pharaoh of the Exodus. But I think if we can date the Exodus pretty much to 1445 BC, and therefore we can, if we are right in our dating of the Exodus, then we can be fairly sure of who the Pharaoh is. But again, there are arguments about it, because some people take what is known as the early date, which is 1445, and the late date, which is sometime in the 1200s BC. Again, there's debate over which one of those is correct, which one of those dates, and therefore, there's about 200 years difference between then, and therefore there would be two different pharaohs that would be under consideration. A lot of people take the 1200 date, or the date in the 1200s, but I think the evidence goes for the early date in 1445 BC. But that's another discussion for another time. Now, he points out that this is probably one of the great ironies, that is, not naming the pharaohs in this account. And it's probably one of the great ironies and lessons of the book. The name of that Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, the one who challenges God himself, is lost to us as far as the exact one. Okay? But everyone today knows the name of Moses. And note that even the names of the two midwives who protect the newborn Hebrews in chapter 1 are given, but not the name of either one of the pharaohs. So, being that that these pharaohs are so, or at least the second pharaoh in specific, is so opposed to God, that it's, like we say, it becomes a symbol of everything that is opposed to God. Now, there may very well be evidence somewhere that the first Pharaoh was prideful, and that this is an ironic and poetic slam against both pharaohs, but I don't remember any particular evidence of the first Pharaoh being so opposed to Jehovah God as the second Pharaoh is. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that this is an ironic or poetic slam against the first Pharaoh. Okay, but I would definitely go with that statement concerning the second Pharaoh, the one from chapter 3 through chapter 15. Now, in chapter 1, I'm getting this mixed up. I was thinking of, when I was talking about the first Pharaoh, I was thinking of the Pharaoh that Joseph was under. Pharaoh of Exodus chapters 1 and 2 is very much opposed to the sons of Israel. I'd have to go back and read the text again to see if there are any against God himself. But being opposed to the sons of Israel and oppressing them definitely is and it definitely toward God, but the specific thing or not, again, I'd have to go back and read the text again in Exodus 1 and 2. But again, as the text opens in the book of Exodus, that the Abrahamic covenant is being fulfilled, continuing to be fulfilled, and there are, they put it here, thousands of descendants. Actually, the estimation, if we have understood the scriptures correctly in the numbering of the men of Israel, ages 20 and above, in the account that is given in Exodus and Numbers, as far as the numbering of the fighting army, okay, men ages 20 and above, then I think the number was 600 and something thousand. Again, it's something I'll have to check to be sure. My computer is not cooperating very well. But concerning the number of descendants, I think the number was 600 and something thousand. So if you multiply that with one wife and one child per man who is in the army, okay, who is part of the fighting force, then you have a minimum of 1.8 million people. Now there is some debate over whether our understanding of the number 1,000, the number 1,000, that is to say, in Hebrew, you have the number, the word that stands for the number 1,000, okay? That's Aleph, I think it is. And then the way Hebrew does that is they put the names of the numbers prior to that, and if they use the number 600, okay, they talk about 600, and then they put the word for 1,000, then you have 600,000, okay? But the debate comes over the word for 1,000. Some people think that it means, just a group, a small group. Other people think that it refers to something else that's similar, and they say that it doesn't mean a literal number of 1,000. Now, I have problems with that because if we're not going to understand that word to be the number 1,000, in this case, there are other cases where the number 1,000 is used, and we we pretty much understand that it means that in those cases. But more specifically, we've got the numbers for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then the Hebrew numbers for 11 through 20, and up to 100, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and then up to 100 is just a combination of the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 5, the 6, the 7, the 8, or the 9, coupled with other forms. So, or other numbers. So the idea is that if we can't trust the number for 1,000, then why do people put a whole lot of stock in the number for 100 or the number for 50? I just have a problem with the idea of giving a different definition to something that has always been understood as in this case the number 1,000. But because people doubt that the Israelites could not have been in the millions, and God could not have supported that many people in the wilderness, okay? And there are other factors that go into this as far as why they would argue that the number 1,000 is not a literal number. But I just have a hard time changing the definition after all these years. I'm not saying it's impossible, but the very idea of God not being able to take care of 1.8 million people in the wilderness, and then that number growing over time, then if God's not able to do that, then what makes us believe in the power of God in anything else? So that's just my understanding at this point of this idea, because again, our authors say that Abraham, childless until late in life, now has thousands of descendants. While that is true, that's a true sign of blessing to have thousands of descendants, it doesn't mean that there's not millions of descendants, okay? All right. But the Israelites are still living within the borders of Egypt, and the blessing of proliferation who now causes the Egyptians to oppose them, because they say as these people grow, as they get stronger, okay, the Egyptians become fearful, because if they join with another nation or another group of people within Egypt, then they could defeat the Egyptians. And see, this is another reason why people doubt the number of 1.8 million, or even 600,000 in the army, is because they say, well, at this level, 600,000 soldiers, they could easily defeat the Egyptians, because they assume that the Egyptians are few in number. Well, I don't know that there's any particular information that we're given as to how many Egyptians there were, because they've had a whole lot longer to grow in population than the Israelites have to this point. So, again, I have my doubts. All right. I said earlier that, let me just look at something real quick here. Yeah, I said earlier that it was at the beginning of chapter 3 that it says that a new Pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph, but it's actually chapter 1 and verse 8. So, again, I'm getting my people mixed up as to different things going on here because my mind has kind of been scattered the past few months. But going on, this Pharaoh oppresses the sons of Israel, puts them under bondage, and because they don't want them to overtake they don't want the Egyptians don't want them to overtake the Egyptians and rule over them. So, as is pointed out here by the authors, the Pharaoh tries 3 consecutive but unsuccessful plans to control the Israelites and their population. Number 1, work them to death. Number 2, order the midwives to kill all newborn Israelite boys at birth. And number 3 was to throw all the newborn Israelite boys in the Nile River. Now, again, in this next, on page 43, they do go into the date of the Exodus. They talk about the 2 major dates. I said 1445. They say 1446. So I guess, 1 year here or there ain't going to make a difference. So if this is the case, that 1446 is the date of the Exodus, then Tutmos III would be the Pharaoh at the time. And they say this is a popular view of evangelical scholars who lean heavily on the Bible itself for chronological determinations, which I do. Using primarily archaeological data, numerous other scholars, including some evangelicals, argue for a later date of between 1280 and 1260 BC. If this is correct, then the Pharaoh of the Exodus would have been Ramses II. Both sides have numerous arguments and counterarguments, and the issue can quickly become complicated. We think that the most important observation is the fact that the Pharaoh's name is not given, in spite of the fact that providing the names of foreign kings and pharaohs is generally the pattern in the Bible. We feel that the Bible's silence on his name is part of the judgment against him, and therefore, since the Bible is silent, we are left to speculate. But again, I'm one who believes that the chronology of the scriptures can be understood, and with some study, and therefore I believe that the 1446 date is correct. All right, so they then go on to discuss these different plans. Okay, and remember that God told Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. When Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites and then brutally murders their innocent newborn babies, we can only gasp and wonder with trembling how God will respond. The same question could be asked of today concerning the murder of innocent children in abortion. But you have a series of serious warnings, which are the plagues. God responds with devastating force. And then finally, in Exodus 11 and 12, God strikes down the firstborn of every Egyptian household. And in Exodus 14, he drowns the entire Egyptian army in the Red Sea. And it is divine poetic justice. Well, Moses, concerning his birth in the early chapters of Genesis, he is born in these terrifying times. His mother is desperate to protect her son. She makes an ark. It's the same word that is used of Noah's ark in Genesis 6 through 9, chapter 6 through 9. But obviously it's a much smaller one. But it's basically the same idea, something that will float on the water, that will save a life, even though the dimensions are a whole lot smaller. It's the same type of vessel. So she makes that. She coats it with pitch, which would keep the water out, and therefore the baby will be safe. Well, when, as they point out, the irony of this is that Pharaoh's decree was to throw all the baby boys in the river. This mother complies, sort of, and indeed places her baby in the river. But another huge irony occurs, for it is one of Pharaoh's daughters who finds baby Moses. She rescues the baby from the river in defiance of her father, and she determines to protect this baby and raise him as her own son. And the future deliverer of Israel, the one who will bring Egypt to her knees in terrible destruction, is rescued and then trained by someone within Pharaoh's own household. So again, irony of ironies, that God's deliverer is going to be brought up and taught by the Egyptians themselves. They're going to train him. They're going to educate him. In fact, it's in the book of Acts. Let me see if I can find the passage real quick. I believe it will be Acts 7. Yeah, Acts chapter 7, verse 22. It says, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. You see, you've probably seen the Disney movie, Prince of Egypt. And basically, I've never seen the movie, but basically the very idea that's contained in the title of that movie is correct. Because if Moses is adopted as a son by the daughter of Pharaoh, then he becomes one of the possible kings of Egypt in the future. Therefore, he is a prince of Egypt. And therefore, he's going to be trained. He's going to be educated at a high level. He would have been educated in warfare, military education, geography. He would have been educated in reading and writing, which was undoubtedly a skill that not many people had. And this is going to prepare him in the military training and so forth. It's going to prepare him to lead the army of Israel, even though he has a general, you might say, in Joshua, who does the actual leading, but Moses is in charge. Ultimately, you might say he is the the Secretary of Defense I guess is what you might say, or even the president who is over the military. Then, so he's prepared for military operations. He's prepared in geography, and you also take into account the fact that Moses spends 40 years in the wilderness, shepherding his father-in-law's sheep in the same area that the Israelites are going to wander for 40 years. So he is very familiar with the area that they're going to wander in. He's very familiar with military leadership and therefore leading a group this large. And he is educated in reading and writing. He would have been educated in the math of the day, whatever science might have been. He was probably educated religiously in the idea of how, the gods of Egypt, who they were, how they worked, supposedly being false gods. Okay, but at the same time, we also know that because his mother becomes his wet nurse, that she is hired by the daughter of Pharaoh to nurse him, and we would say that is definitely by the providence of God. Then he also knows from her education of him, which is, I think, implied very heavily, he also knows of the true God, Jehovah God. And he also knows that he is an Israelite by birth, because later on, when he goes out among the people and he sees two of his fellow Israelites fighting, then he tries to break them up and reason with them. And he also tries to protect them, because he sees initially, before breaking up the fight between two Israelites, initially he kills an Egyptian who is beating an Israelite. And he hides him in the sand, thinking that all is secret, all is silent and not known about him killing this Egyptian. But when he breaks up the fight between two Israelites, one of them says, or maybe I forget which, says, "Who made you a ruler over us? You're gonna kill us like you did that Egyptian?" This makes Moses wonder if Pharaoh knows about it, if it's known among the slaves of Israel. Then maybe Pharaoh knows about it and he has to flee. That's when he goes to his own wilderness wanderings in taking care of his father-in-law's sheep in Midian. And he comes to, in those journeys, near the end of that 40 years, he comes to the mountain of God while he's shepherding those sheep, and he meets God in the burning bush, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But my point is that Moses is prepared for leading the children of Israel. He's prepared for leading their army, and he is prepared by the education of the Egyptians. He's prepared to write the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which are attributed to him very clearly in those books, or at least in 4 of those books. Okay? So, you can see the providence of God working everything out in this situation. Okay? It's at the burning bush that God commissions Moses and gives him the power to prove that 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 he is from God, that he is bringing a message from God to Pharaoh and to the initially to the elders of Israel, to let them know that he is the one who is supposed to be their deliverer. And so I guess we covered those paragraphs. Let's look at the slides and see. If we've missed anything here. Okay. We come to the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 17, God reveals himself to Moses and calls him as his representative before Pharaoh and the children of Israel and the leader of them. And it points out here on page 45 that in Exodus 3:1 to 4:17, God reveals himself to Moses and calls him to action. The passage brings together three major themes that are often closely associated throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament as well. And that is God's presence, God's holiness, and God's power. His presence is simply him making himself known to Moses by presenting himself within this burning bush that is not consumed by the fire that's in it. And then his holiness is demonstrated in the fact that he tells Moses, to remove his shoes because the ground all around the bush and where he is present is holy. And then when Moses objects to God's plan to send him, God gives him certain signs that he can use to prove that he is from God, that he is supposed to do what God has told him to do. And in doing so, he gives him great power, the ability to work miracles. But the statement that he makes in chapter 3 and verse 12 in working to convince Moses of his calling of him, he says, I will be with you. And therefore this again speaks of the presence of God, the fellowship of God, that he is with him. Okay. Now, the next thing that is pointed out is the fact that when Moses is still doubtful about whether he's the right man for the job, he asks God, he says, when I identify myself to the elders of Israel, who am I going to say sent me? And God says, I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. Now, This is a, this is the name of God. Okay, this is the particular name of God, and it is the basis. This particular word is pronounced Yit-Yeh in Hebrew, but it is the basis for it, that is, the name Yahweh or Jehovah is built off of this designation here. So I am who I am would be the basic definition of Yahweh or Jehovah. Again, depending on how you pronounce that term. Now, this is the name that comes over into Greek as ego eimi, which literally says I. That is ego, okay, from which we get our word ego, okay. So ego is I, and then eimi is I am. So when God says in Exodus 3:14, I am who I am, the phrase ego eimi in the New Testament is I am. So it's basically a repetition with just a slight difference of the name from Exodus 3. So whenever Jesus uses this name of himself, especially I believe it is in John chapter 8, where he is confronted by the Jews, and there's this discussion about, Abraham longed to see my day, and he was able to see it, and they said, well, how did you ever see Abraham, or how did, I forget the exact wording of the phrase or the passage, but basically you're less than 50 years old. You're a young man. How in the world did you know or see Abraham? And Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And therefore, they understood him to be saying, and he was saying that he is taking the name of God for himself. That is, Jesus is saying, I'm God. I am Jehovah, in the sense of I am deity. Okay? He's not God the Father, but he's God the Son, but he's still God. Okay? So you've got God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit being the Trinity. I think I've mentioned that earlier. So every time that Jesus uses that term throughout, especially the book of John, that term is found many times in the book of John. And John, the Gospel of John, is totally concerned with proving that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is deity. And it starts out, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And in verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Father. So this is extremely important in our understanding of Scripture. Then, in Exodus 3:14 and 15, God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, Jesus uses this very passage to prove that there is a resurrection. There will be a resurrection, because some Sadducees came to him and said, gave him a parable of a woman who had married a man, and he died, and therefore the law of Moses, he died without any children, okay? She and he had no children. The law of Moses said that when a man dies without any children, the brother of that man is supposed to take the widow as his wife and raise up children to the name of the dead brother. This is what happens in the book of Ruth, okay, with Boaz and Ruth. Well, the Sadducees, who do not believe in the resurrection, okay, and do not believe in angels or any spirit beings of any kind, but the resurrection in particular, they don't believe in that, so they're trying to trap Jesus. And they say there's this woman who married a man, he died, she married his brother, and they all died all the way down to the seventh brother. You know, how crazy is this? But it's their illustration, okay? And the question was, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Remembering that they don't believe in a resurrection, but they're trying to trap Jesus, trying to trick him into making a mistake, okay? Well, first off, he says to them, you do err not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God, okay? So Jesus is telling somebody, you're wrong. Try that in today's world, telling somebody you're wrong, and see all the kinds of names that you're called, okay? But the idea is, he says you're wrong, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God, because in the burning bush passage, God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he says, God is not the God of the living, or not the God of the dead, but of the living. So the point is that there is going to be a resurrection, because even though Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Exodus chapter 3 had been dead for, more than 200 years, God is saying to Moses, and then Jesus uses this passage to say that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive. Not in the flesh, but in the spirit. Their souls are still alive. And we know this to be true because Jesus uses Abraham in the account of Lazarus and the rich man in the book of Luke. And he says that when Lazarus died, he was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom, where he was comforted and, relieved of his pain and misery in this life. And the rich man found himself in torment. Okay? So their roles in this life were reversed in the next. But the point is, Jesus mentions Abraham. And then the rich man has a conversation with Abraham in that realm, in that spiritual realm, and there's a back and forth between Abraham and the rich man. So this is just one other proof that Abraham is still alive, even to this day. His soul is alive. So this is at least two occasions where this burning bush passage is used in the New Testament to prove certain things. Okay, so you can see again the connections between a thread moving from the beginning to the end. And it all ties together so completely. And this is just one more piece of evidence that the Bible is from God, and that that God exists, and that God wants to be back in fellowship with mankind, and He has put together a plan for that to happen. And again, this is the biblical world view. We look at the world through the eyes of God, through the eyes of the Scriptures, that we can learn the true nature of history, okay? How the world came to be, and why there is suffering and sin and disease and all kinds of pain and problems in this world. There's an explanation for that, as we have seen, starting in Genesis chapter 3, and so forth. Now, again, there are other stories, myths. I say not other myths. There are myths that purport to give the reason for all these problems, but they just don't measure up to the Scriptures. And this is what we're wanting to. We're hoping that you will be educated in and come to the knowledge of that in your life. That's our hope, our aim with this class. At the very least, to let you know that this is an option as a worldview. But more than that, that it is the correct worldview, the only one that is correct, and the only one that will help you be eternally in heaven with God, and therefore back in direct fellowship with God. Okay, we're about to the end of our time, but I want you to read. I won't take the time to go into it any more than I have, but I want you to take the time to read the difference between the names of God that are given in the Scriptures. Again, I am who I am is they say a word play on this name of Yahweh, but I think they say that Yahweh is probably related to the Hebrew verb that means to be. Again, that verb is yityeh. It just simply means to be. It means to exist, and it fits perfectly with the idea of having no beginning and no ending. God just simply exists. And when Jesus takes that name for himself, he is claiming his eternality. Okay, no beginning and no end. But I think there's more of a connection than these authors want to let on. But what they're trying to do is show you the difference between another name of God, but this other name, Elohim, is used, as they point out, of any God that is named in the Scriptures or outside the Scriptures. It's a generic name. And as they say, most English Bibles will translate Elohim simply as God with a big G when the reference is to the true God of Israel, and it will translate it God or gods with a little g when the reference is to pagan idols. But as they point out also in that paragraph, the nations surrounding Israel worship lots of gods or Elohim. Israel's Elohim is Yahweh. Okay, so Yahweh is God's personal name, and Elohim is his general name. You might, I guess, an illustration that would bring it more to our understanding would be that Yahweh is the first name of God and Elohim is the second name of God. Okay, that's not a true correlation from one to one idea, but it's close. Okay, because my name is James G. My personal name is James, but I carry the family name of G. Now, Elohim is not necessarily we would certainly not talk about Elohim as a family name because there's only one Elohim. That is, there's only one true God. And all these other pagan gods that are mentioned are false. In fact, when you read through the book of Isaiah, look at the sarcasm that he uses on several occasions to speak of the idols that people worshipped. I'll just go through one quickly where he says that a man goes out and he cuts a tree down. With part of it, he builds a fire and warms himself and cooks his food. And with another part, he makes a chair or a table or whatever. And with another part, he fashions an idol. And then he takes that idol and puts it up on the mantle above maybe the fireplace or whatever. He puts it up somewhere in his house. And then he has to take nails to nail it down to that place so that it doesn't fall over. And then he falls down before it and worships and says, "Thank you for creating me." Again, pure and total sarcasm. That this thing that he has cut down, this thing that he has fashioned, he now bows down to and says, "Thank you for creating me." Now, I understand that the idol itself is simply a representation of this God that is supposedly, doing these things, creating and giving blessings and rain and storms, in the case of Baal, okay? But, a God of fertility. But the fact is, this is the main reason why God says at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, you will not make any images of me, whether it be of any of the things in the heavens above the earth, or the things on the earth, or the things under the earth. You're not going to try to describe me in some physical way. You're not going to try to represent me in some physical way, because I'm the one who created all this stuff. And therefore, to try to represent me by the created stuff is to lessen me and my character and my person, and elevating the creation above the Creator. And this is made very clear in Romans chapters 1 and 2 about the progression of worshiping the created things rather than the one who created them, leads to, over time, progresses into certain sins. The one that is named is homosexuality. Because people have elevated, again, the created things above the Creator, including humanity, okay, who once you start worshiping the created things, you yourself being a created being, then worship humanity and consider yourself as God. And then once you can consider yourself as God, then man, anything goes. You're in charge of your own life. Again, this goes back to pride, because pride is the root of all sin. Okay? Well, I've gone over again, but I hope you have gotten what I've tried to say. We will pick up with the rest of chapter 3 when we come back in the last video for this week, session number 10. As always, I'm here to help. Call on me for anything you need.